Okay, so that is the public webinar open. I'm not going to wait too long for people to join. I know we have got people joining, but we're also going to be publishing this online afterwards. So I'd rather just get started. Don't want to waste anybody's time. But thank you so much for joining us today. This is our third webinar within a series of three as part of our Walkshop, which has been based in and around Glasgow and Loch Lomond on the topic of nuclear risks and long-term peacekeeping. A workshop, you might know this, you may not. A workshop is our educational initiative, which is combining both hiking but also interactive discussion with experts like yourselves, but also among each other. I will, hoping I'm not going to ruin my sort of network connection here, show the room very quickly to see that these are our participants who've been here all week. We've no hiking today. Today we've been at the Women's Library in Glasgow, where they've got an amazing exhibition about the history of protest movements and peace in the UK and beyond. But the last few days we've been hiking in and around Loch Lomond. My name's Grace Clover. I'm with the Foundation for the Rights of Future Generations, where I work on the academic journal, but also on the board. Would you please introduce yourselves and give a little bit about, well, firstly, your name, although that's clear for everyone from the screen, your affiliation, and I totally understand that people will be representing themselves as opposed to their organizations, but maybe a little bit about your background, how you've got into the world of peacekeeping and security, or what it is that you work in, if that's not explicitly the case. That would be wonderful. Can I start with perhaps Bill, as you've got your microphone on, would you please take it away? Thank you very much.
Hello, hi. My name is Bill Kidd. I'm a member of the Scottish Parliament, and I am also a co-president of the organisation PNND, which is an international parliamentarian organisation, Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, which is a big name for quite a big organisation, which has a good reputation internationally. We do a lot of presentations at United Nations and parliaments around the world. And we basically are an organisation which is looking for a nuclear weapons-free world. And my my role, as I say, is as a co-president, but that means that I then actually speak on behalf of PNND and other organisations internationally when it comes to nuclear disarmament matters and conferences. I have been in the Scottish Parliament for four parliaments now, and during that time, we have had two two occasions when the Parliament has passed, as a Parliament, passed a nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, and we are very proud of the fact that we have a government and we have many members from a variety of political parties who all want the nuclear weapons removed from Scotland. And that is a first step towards Scotland's contribution towards a world without nuclear weapons. So I think that's particularly important that we do emphasise that we're not being narrow and self-absorbed by getting rid of nuclear weapons from Scotland. We want that to be a sign, our contribution, that the world should have all nations looking to do exactly the same as that. And they certainly should not be doing what the United Kingdom is looking to do, which is, in spite of being signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, they are looking to increase the number of nuclear weapons which they hold, which breaks Article 6 of the NPT. And really, if you're going to sign up to nuclear international treaties, then don't break them. If you're going to hold yourself as some kind of image that others should follow, uh,
Mm.
you shouldn't actually be then sort of breaking that and going in the opposite direction.
we're going to get into that in a minute, but thank you so much for that
Thank you.
introduction.
No, thank you. And I'm sorry if I rambled on a bit, but there you go.
No,
Thank you.
no, that's perfect. Thank you. So just a reminder for the others, please, yeah, name, affiliation, and your background. I'm just going to double check in the chat because, as some of you are aware, we were supposed to be having Sophie join us from C&D today, and I think maybe one of her colleagues has started to represent her. But you're in the chat. Samuel, do you want to send me a little message just to check what's going on there? But I'm going to let the others introduce themselves in the time being. Eleanor, would you mind introducing yourself, please?
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Elena. I'm originally from Norway, but I also have a Scottish father, so I have connection to Scotland through my family and also through university because I study international relations at the University of Edinburgh. And alongside my studies, I am an intern at the United Nations House Scotland, where I've been an intern for about a year and a half now. So my connection to nuclear disarmament through the UN House is through the nuclear disarmament team and the team that works on podcasts. So I'm currently working on a podcast on feminist perspectives on nuclear disarmament. And as well as that, I am, because I'm from Norway, I'm the Norwegian youth delegate to the Council of Europe, to the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities. And in Norway, I also work with an organization called CISV International, which is an international educational peace organization. So I'm currently in the board of my local chapter in Rogaland in Norway. So we work on peace education internationally. So that's a bit of my background.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from Mexico today. That is really amazing. Nick, could you perhaps take over for me?
Hi, everyone. I'm Nick Ritchie. I'm a professor of international security at the University of York, and I've been involved in nuclear disarmament for 25 years or so. Started working for an NGO called the Oxford Research Group for about 5 years on these issues. Did my PhD at Bradford's Department of Peace Studies on US nuclear weapons after the Cold War. And for the past, I guess, sort of 15 years or so, been involved in the process that led up to the negotiation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in 2017. And then since then, involved in the processes for the expansion and implementation of that treaty.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for joining us. Okay, last but not least, Tim, would you please introduce yourself?
Yep. Hi, everyone. I'm in the UK. I'm in London. It's probably slightly hotter than in Mexico for the first time in history in this part of the world. I'm the Secretary of British Pugwash, which is a group which basically brings together experts, scientists, and the public to look at issues around weapons of mass destruction, specifically nuclear issues. The 70th anniversary of the one of the key documents that founded Pugwash is coming around this year, which is the Russell Einstein Manifesto, and we'll be doing a big event on that at the Royal Society in a week's time. So check out our website because there'll be a YouTube link to watch that online if you're interested. I've done a bunch of stuff with different groups around like peace and social justice issues, a bit of research. I did my PhD on nuclear disarmament, wrote a book on it, which is extremely painful, but good. I've done lots of activism, including direct action and campaigns. So I've kind of got a bit of different bits of experience around research and activism. So yeah, happy to talk about that today. And I haven't said hello to the other panelists. So hi, other panelists. Good to be with you. And hello, everyone in the room.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Just so you're aware, I'm not ignoring you. I have a screen to my left and my colleague who's supporting me to my right. So I'm not just sort of chatting blithely into the ether, I promise. Well, it's great to have you all here. Thank you so much. I'm going to get straight away started. As a broad structure, I think I'm going to ask a question, and these are topics people have written books about. Many of you have, so I know we could chat all evening, but I think sort of 5 to 10 minutes for each answer as a maximum would be amazing. Thank you very much. So I'm going to start with yourself, Bill, I think, and Nick, if you'd like to add in, or anyone would like to add in, that'd be wonderful. So perhaps a little bit of background to what we're talking about today. We're talking about the British nuclear weapons system, Trident. We're talking about whether it's credible, whether it's ever been credible. And that's a question we can approach from a number of different angles. So is it effective? Can we associate or can we sort of prove causation, just correlation between the fact that we've had nuclear weapons since the end of sort of the early end of the 40s, but is there actually correlation between that and relative peace in that period? Is it cost effective? And is it democratic? These are all questions that we're going to be dealing with. We're going to be dealing with the question of Scotland's, particularly Scotland's role in this. As we've mentioned, been hiking around Scotland and near the naval base in Clyde ourselves this week, and then talking about some social movements for disarmament. So my question would be to yourself, Bill, and I apologise, I'm now looking at my screen over here, is I appreciate that Scottish independence might feel a little bit further away than it did 10 years ago, particularly since the 2022 Supreme Court ruling. But in a world in which there was a Scottish independent Scotland without nuclear weapons, what impact would that have for the UK's nuclear posturing? I mean, Nick, we listened to a podcast that you did with Ben Snow a couple of years ago in which you spoke about there's no other list of credible or legitimate place for very, very difficult places for Trident to be taken. The options of being taken to France, for example, is logistically very tricky. We know, for example, the C&D has often been writing about that there's no legitimate or logistically or strategically important places to place Trident. So my question to you, Bill, is about what would an independent Scotland without nuclear weapons look like? And what kind of precedent would that set to the rest of the world in terms of nuclear posturing?
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for the question. Now, I'll just emphasise again that we would like to see a UK without nuclear weapons as much as we would like to see Scotland, but we believe that we've got a better chance of achieving that in the nearer time, in the shorter term. It would have to be something which the Scottish people were strongly in favour of, and it has proven to be so over many years that is the case, that they're not in favour of these nuclear weapons being kept here within 30 miles of half of Scotland's population. And there are leaks that take place from the base down at Faslane and Coolport, and in the Clyde and in other areas. So we believe that Scottish people have shown frequently that they're in all sorts of ways that they're not in favour of nuclear weapons continuing to be here since 1960 or thereabouts. Actually, they've been sighted down there. So we want rid of them. I was very honoured actually to present a letter of support for the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons at the United Nations. I presented the president of the conference, and I presented with her with a letter from the First Minister of Scotland at the time, that was Nicola Sturgeon, saying that if Scotland had at that point, and it will be its position to look to be in a place to actually support the treaty, and we would sign it. And we supported the passing of the treaty at the United Nations, and it did go through. Very, very pleased about that, obviously, and it has grown in international prominence since then. The Scottish Government's position hasn't changed, still actually being thoroughly a party of, and a government of, which is more important actually, a government of commitment to the eradication of nuclear weapons from Scotland. Now, I don't know if a lot of sort of younger crowd of people actually might not necessarily know who John Ainslie was. John Ainslie, a very, very significant figure
Yes.
in nuclear disarmament, and in Scottish political movement for nuclear disarmament also. And he actually wrote Nowhere to Go,
Yes.
as his belief investigated that if it goes, when it goes from Scotland, the UK wouldn't have anywhere else that it could actually site the Trident submarines, etc., and all that with the nuclear weapons. Now, we do know, because we've heard recently, that the UK is now talking about going back to having a fleet of aircraft which can carry nuclear weapons as well.
I want to
And that
mention
is
that, the elephant
something,
in the room, yes.
well, yes, indeed. But that is something that we really, really have to actually take on board. At the moment, however, we have to work as hard as possible to get rid of the nuclear threat from Faslane Coolport, and we have to have everyone, not just in Scotland, but across the UK, working for that aim. This whole nonsense about the UK having a special position in the world because it holds nuclear weapons is really something which actually we have to challenge. We shouldn't be spending that amount of money on these weapons, which are not supposed to be used against anybody. But the threat is always there. So I think we have to all stand together. And that means here in Scotland, looking for an independent Scotland, as I am, to get rid of as part of that, to get rid of the nuclear weapons. But we need everybody in the UK to be working in the same direction because these weapons are extraordinarily dangerous for the future of everyone in the world.
Thank you very much for that answer. I mean, I have a further question coming up later, so I don't want to go into it too much, but I agree the idea that sort of the UK has some status harking back to its time as a global power is something that we really need to sort of disengage from, move away from. It's not helpful in terms of global relationships, not helpful in terms of global inequality. And that's really a sort of reputation we need to sort of try and move away from, detach our national identity from that specific point. Can I invite the rest of you to come in on this question? I mean, the question is Trident legitimate? Could it be moved somewhere elsewhere? And what is the impact of Keir Starmer's most recent announcement about the potential 12 fighter jets going to Norfolk RF bases? Perhaps Nick, or Elena, or Tim, would one of you like to answer that question?
Yeah, I can say a few things on that just to supplement what Bill has said. I think the first thing to note is that being a nuclear armed state for the UK is incredibly expensive. The system that we currently have, the Trident system, Trident missiles, UK warheads based on an American design on the fleet of 4 nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines that incorporate an awful lot of American design and hardware and software, is very, very expensive. And that's just to sustain on a bit of a shoestring, really, this broad system of systems that constitutes the UK's nuclear weapons complex. So to think of doing anything different, anything new on top of that, for example, having to move everything that's at Faslane to what would essentially be, well, Faslane and Coolport. Coolport's the really important thing here in terms of where you would store the warheads when they're not on the boats. They're stored in these magazines built into the granite mountains around Coolport. There's very little geology that's similar and close to a deep water port in England or Wales. There are a couple of potential candidates that were explored in the 60s, but you really, it's just infeasible politically and economically to think about replacing those facilities at Faslane, the submarine base, and at Coolport with all the facilities there for offloading the Trident missiles and storing the warheads. It would be fantastically expensive.
Yeah.
Take decades and decades to do. And so realistically, I mean, obviously these things aren't impossible, right? If Scotland voted for independence and the government negotiating with the English and Welsh government in London was absolutely adamant that as part of that settlement, nuclear weapons had to go within a time frame. And we mentioned John Ainsley. John did some great work on this to look at the time frames involved, and he was looking at kind of 45 years to get these weapons safely repatriated back to the UK. Then I suppose if the government of the day decided to pour all their all available government resource in a sort of Manhattan Project style initiative to rebuild those facilities somewhere south of the border. It could, but you know, the politics of that and then the sheer cost difficulty suggest not. So I think a decision by a future independent Scottish government to as part of the deal to settle lots of issues that would need to be settled between a sovereign Scotland and a sovereign sort of rest of UK did unequivocally involve the removal of nuclear weapons, then I think that will probably be it for the UK for a submarine launch capability. I think it
Yeah.
would in effect be a form of structural disarmament for the
Okay.
UK.
Thank you very much for that answer. Eleanor and Tim, would you be interested in joining this conversation on this particular topic, or should I move on to the next question?
I mean, I can, unless you want Elena, touch on the issue of legitimacy.
Please go ahead. That'd be great.
Yeah, I was just going to mention this because there was quite an important book that came out around the time of the Trident replacement debates by Rebecca Johnson and N.G. Zelter called Scotland's Responsibility in International Law. And basically the issue there is like saying that Scotland does have a moral responsibility to, you know, because of the sighting of Trident nuclear weapons, to take action given its obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which, as has been said under Article 6, compels signatories to take good faith steps to step down the nuclear ladder and ultimately achieve disarmament. Then there's the issues around the ICJ 1996 ruling regarding the threat or use of nuclear weapons. And so the book, which again I would refer you to, discusses the obligations not to threaten or use nuclear weapons because there's very small circumstances where anyone conceive that their use would be legal under international humanitarian law. So I think that's the basis for a lot of the questions around illegitimacy. And the other thing I just wanted to flag up is that I do think we also have to look at wider questions of legitimacy regarding the history of the UK's nuclear weapons, whether it's regarding the acquisition of uranium, the use of nuclear tests, the nuclear threats against non-nuclear weapon states, deploy nuclear weapons overseas, all these kinds of things. I think they're things that aren't often discussed or noted for obvious reasons by people who claim Trident to be legitimate, because it's always framed as in extreme circumstances and we're reluctant to have this awful weapon. So yeah, those are some of the points I would highlight in terms of legitimacy. But yeah, John Ainsley's work, I worked on the Ainsley archive digitizing it, and you can access a lot of his reports online, like Disarming Trident and Trident Nowhere to Go. So yeah, definitely worth checking out his work.
Yeah, no, Trident Nowhere to Go is been a very foundational thing I've been reading whilst preparing for this. It's a very helpful work. We were speaking to Susie Snyder yesterday from ICANN, and she was emphasizing the same point as you about just because, you know, nuclear weapons and deterrence is theoretically a system by which the threat is enough and they're not going to be employed, that doesn't mean there's no explosion. So testing has very dramatic implications for the environment. We also know in terms of the areas in which those are being tested, that's very controversial. Today we saw in the Glasgow Women's Library a section about testing which was going on in the Nevada desert, and very controversial testing in terms of the ownership of that land and the sort of local indigenous communities. So we know that just because nuclear weapons are theoretically not being used, it doesn't mean they're not a threat in and of themselves. I've got two things I'd like to touch on following on from this, and I'm going to be unhelpful and raise them both now to see if which one will spark more conversation. I hope that's okay. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is, as we've said, we would ideally want a UK without nuclear weapons, but were it to be a Scotland, but independent Scotland without nuclear weapons, we can also discuss that. What kind of precedent would that set for the rest of the world? So this is a hypothetical future, but what kind of precedent would that set? How could the UK, Scotland, or indeed any other state set itself up to change the global world order? And is there any chance that the UK can lead the way in disarmament whilst not making strategic sacrifice itself? I mean, it seems like there's a global inequality there. The second question is about democratic deficits. I mean, I think when you were speaking, Bill, about the large proportion of Scottish people who feel very threatened by having the nuclear weapons in the base at Fuz Lane and in Coulport. Without direct representation, it seems it's unclear that is a democratic decision to have them there. From our perspective, we're the foundation for the rights of future generations. So when I think about democratic deficits, for me, there's always a parallel between what are the long-term impacts of deterrence of nuclear weapons and the potential of nuclear war, in terms of these are people living in the future who don't have voices. So there's a parallel there. I apologize, that wasn't really a question, those were two comments, but would anyone like to speak to either of those things, either setting a global precedent or democratic deficits? I think there's also a parallel to the Global South and or so-called Global South who does not have a vote on nuclear weapons currently. Bill, please go ahead.
Thank you again. I hope I'm not jumping in too quickly and other people have got important things to say actually, but you know, yes, it would be a very dramatic circumstance if having these weapons removed from Scotland, in particular, as I think we've all said, that would then put the UK in a position of not having anywhere to actually keep these because, you know, if they put them in the Ile-de-France, I think it might not go down particularly well with very large numbers of people who voted for Brexit, say, for instance. And the other place that they could actually put them is over in the United States, actually on the coast there in Georgia, I think it is. But well, that would just actually be putting the nuclear weapons back where they really actually come from anyway. But it would also be another breach of international treaty with keeping your nuclear weapons in another sovereign state's lands. However, we do know, of course, that there have been nations which have had nuclear facility in terms of weapons on their territories, which have got rid of them. You know, South Africa was one of them.
Yeah.
And you can also, if a place that I've been a couple of times is Kazakhstan. And when they became independent from what was the breakup of the Soviet Union, they got rid of the nuclear weapons from their lands, and with particular reason in their case, because under the Soviet Union they had been used for 456 nuclear test explosions, which have even to this day left 1.5 million people with genetic damage. And this was something that they were not going to continue to have. America paid for it, and Russia took the weapons back into its own territory, but they got rid of them. It can be done. We can move forward away from these weapons, and we just have to have the courage, I think, actually, to put ourselves forward, and not wait until somebody else looks as though they might do it as well. Somebody has to make the first step.
Yeah.
And I think it's likely to be that it'll be the UK's nuclear weapons that will go first.
You think it's likely that the UK will be the first nuclear state to get rid of its nuclear weapons?
Well, only because Scotland becomes independent, but yes.
Okay.
Sorry about that political stuff. But no, I would like to see it anyway,
Yes.
simply because it's not actually benefiting the people of the UK to have those weapons here. It seems to be benefiting a certain political mindset, which puts a national position in the international structure as being more important than the lives of your people, the lives of around the world, and also the finances, which really are extraordinarily they're unsustainable, actually.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I can't agree more. I mean, if you think about the opportunity costs that are being included in this, the kind of things that money could be spent on otherwise, it's extraordinary, completely. Eleanor, could I perhaps ask you speaking as a youth advocate, but also from Norway, what's your perspective on sort of European relationships around nuclear weapons? I mean, Norway's been very key in peace talks. I know that. equally, there's been sort of renewed discussion about what would a Eurobomb look like. I know maybe not a totally serious suggestion for some people, but has been raised in recent months. What's your perspective on that?
So, obviously, Norway doesn't have their own nuclear weapons, but they do follow and support deterrence policy because of their involvement in NATO. But what I see as a young person is an increase of the threat of nuclear war and use of nuclear weapons is rising in Norway amongst young people. So for young people today in Norway, due to the current situation in the world, a lot of people are afraid of the nuclear weapons being used. And I do think that thinking of young people as the future generations, as with your organization, I think the voice is really important as well to listen to, and listen to see that this threat of the weapons being used is, as it's considered, being rising. I think if the UK then take out and be the first one to make the move on removing the weapons, I think could be a really positive move. But currently, there's not a lot of European support for example, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. As I observed in New York at the third meeting of states parties, there's a big representation of NGOs, but from governments, there are almost none. Only 3 countries signed from Europe, which is obviously very sad. There was no Norwegian representation from government at the third meeting of states parties, but there was a lot of NGO representation. So I do think that amongst the people, it's support for nuclear disarmament. But I think because of the political situation in the world right now and with the governments, I think that's why it's very sad to see that there's little representation at these meetings. But it's very positive for me to see at least NGOs and civil society being very for the prohibition of the nuclear weapons.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the NGO presence is something that I've observed just through our last week, in which we've been speaking to so many people doing research with different perspectives, some more pro-deterrence than others, but that world is clearly very involved in this, whereas governments sometimes more divided. I'd like to sort of stay on this topic of sort of generational support for nuclear weapons with you, Eleanor, unless anyone would like to respond to what Eleanor's just said. Tim, you were staring off into the distance like you were thinking very clearly, but I don't want to pick on you if you haven't if you haven't got something
I
to
agree with
say.
her. I mean, there was a report that came out that I noted that I think it was by the Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor, and said that whilst over 2/3 of the world's states already abide by the TPNW prohibitions, 45 states still engage in activities that aren't compatible with the treaty. And of those states, as Eleanor says, about 70% are in Europe. So if you've got Scotland or the UK, a major power or middle power, taking these kinds of steps, it would set a precedent and could set off a domino effect around Europe. So yeah, that's just the point I wanted to make on that, unless you want me to address any of the other points you're looking at.
If you have any thoughts to the other points you'd like to address, then by all means, please.
I mean, I think that it's worth thinking about the complicated nature of disarmament. It's something that I've kind of tried to get to grips with doing the research I've done on it. Like with Scotland's particular case, I think if I'm not wrong, in 2012, Scotland said it would, if it became independent, join NATO. So that does raise issues in that even if you were an independent state who'd divested yourself of this capability, but were joining a military alliance which doesn't rule in or out nuclear weapons and is currently facing off against Russia and other states globally, like what does that mean? So I guess what I'm meaning there is like, how are you framing disarmament? Is it a technocratic scenario where you say we just can't afford it, or we don't have the capability to build it? Or are you making a deeper moral point as a country saying we just think these are morally immoral and illegal? And those things will lead to different consequences. They have different implications. So I'm just putting that question out there, really. And I'll be interested to hear what Bill's thoughts on that are too.
Bill, would you like to respond to that? You've been named specifically, but you don't have to, of course.
Yeah, okay, certainly. Look, there has been strong discussion, shall we say, within the SNP and others going for independence on the basis of the idea of if you are NATO as a nuclear shield element sort of thing, and they can say that it's a military alliance, but that the nuclear weapons are an integral part of that. Not every country which is a member of NATO has or is willing to allow nuclear weapons to be based on their soil. But as a personal basis, I am rather wary, shall I say, about the idea of NATO being something which I'd be happy for Scotland to join if it were as an independent country. If it were to do so, I know very significant numbers, potentially the majority of the SNP membership would actually want that to be significantly written in, that it would be part of an alliance, but not willing to be part of the base or even allowing nuclear weapons carrying ships or whatever to actually come into Scottish ports and work from here. So it's a bit complex and it's quite right to bring it up actually. But to be honest, yes, I believe, and I've said it before, that this should be a step towards Scotland showing its face for the rest of the world as being the way towards nuclear disarmament across the planet, rather than just being happy to sit in their own wee corner and hope that everybody else ignores us. I don't think that's the right way to go. I do know that, for instance, got a lot of friends in Ireland who are very, very anti-nuclear, and Ireland I've been really happy to see them attending United Nations and speaking out against nuclear weapons on every occasion. So it can be done. It's not easy, and there will be disagreements. But unless we go in the right direction in the first place, we're not really moving anywhere at all.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, like you say, South Africa, I mentioned earlier, South Africa has set a precedent, or as one example of how we think what we think might seem impossible actually have been possible in the past. So it's important to open our minds up to these possible futures in which that is one eventuality. Nick, I think you put your hand up, as did you, Bill.
Yeah, can I just say one last thing there? Sorry, I do apologise. When I mentioned Ireland, I can also mention New Zealand.
Yes.
I've also got a lot of contacts in New Zealand. They actually banned American nuclear warships carrying nuclear weapons from their waters and from landing in their ports, and they were relegated by America from being an ally to being a friend. So there you go. They weren't written off completely, but they did manage to carry through an important symbol for other countries as well to stand up to, say that no, you're not doing it in our name and you're not using our territories to do it in either.
Yes, no, New Zealand is another one that I would have named as sort of setting a strong precedent for disarmament. Nick, would you like to respond? You had your hand up before. Sorry, I'm running this like a school run. That's not the intention. You, by all means, just speak.
Yeah, just a couple of points really on the democracy issue. I
Perfect.
guess the first to note is that I'm sure people in the room and online are very familiar with the ways in which places like South Asia, the Middle East, East Asia get framed as sources of real nuclear danger. But we have this contradiction in Europe, where Europe understands itself as the home of liberal democracy, but it's Europe that's the region that's most consumed by the security ideology of nuclear deterrence, far and away. And that contradiction is often rationalized by nuclear exceptionalism, that reflects Europe's imperial history. It's important to acknowledge that the way in which other non-European regions are framed as sources of nuclear danger, and yet Europe framed as a source of nuclear rationality, responsibility, and so on. And that's done through nuclear exceptionalism. I think just one or two other things to note on the to extend that is to note that nuclear weapons are profoundly illiberal, profoundly undemocratic, for the key reason that nuclear weapons, the practice of nuclear deterrence is based on the ability to use nuclear weapons as intended when intended by the state that owns them. And that requires concentrating godlike powers of destruction in the hands of often one or two individuals, because decisions would need to be taken necessarily over very, very short time periods in the event of a conflict escalating to nuclear use. And so we've got Keir Starmer today. I mean, heaven help us, it wasn't long ago when it was Boris Johnson who had the power to incinerate entire societies in a few hours, concentrated in his hands. So nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence as a security ideology are profoundly anti-democratic. It doesn't matter whether it's a democratic state or an authoritarian state. They are profoundly anti-democratic weapons. And just on the setting a global precedent thing, just to echo what Tim said, really, it's not going to set any precedent if the UK government says we really love nuclear weapons and we're really cross with Scotland because we can't have them. The precedent would be set by recognizing that security as understood for the citizenry in the century that we're in is not going to be delivered in any way through nuclear deterrence. I mean, that was the case in the Cold War, but it's even more so in the era that we live in of a kind of cascading transnational polycrises, right? Nuclear weapons are just make absolutely no sense whatsoever. And if a country like the UK as a UN Security Council permanent member were to be prompted or elect a government that would seriously align security in terms of the security of the citizenry with the challenges that we face with very limited resources, and would make the case, which would be a pretty straightforward one, that nuclear weapons make little sense within that. That will be the precedent-setting aspect of this.
Yes, no, I entirely relate to what you're saying. I mean, I think we have been discussing this whole week about we want to have a nuclear-free world, but also what positive peace look like? How can we remove sort of causes for conflict in the long run? And just for example, because the UK and France, two nuclear states, are not currently pointing them at each other, it doesn't mean that they're not contributing to this mindset, which is prioritizing security and deterrence issues at the risk of the rest of the world and non-nuclear states. I would like to move slightly on to thinking about, okay, how are we going to get towards this world? What are the things that normal people can do, parliamentarians, NGOs, but also normal people like the students and young professionals I have in the room with me today? How can we be moving forward to this and contributing to that? We've been discussing this whole week as we've been having multiple webinars, but we went to Faz Lane Peace Camp yesterday, where we met just two members, and I appreciate their rhetoric that it's important to have even one member at the camp to keep hope alive. But the feeling was the morale, I would say, was rather low. So returning to the topic of disarmament movements and sort of protest movements, perhaps I direct this to you, Tim, and the first instance, but I will open up the question to the room afterwards. Could you tell me a little bit about the role that peace camps, peace protests have had in shaping nuclear policy, for better or for worse? And here I'm particularly thinking about Green and Common, but I'm also thinking about the Glaswegian Eskimos, for example, a number of anti-nuclear movements in the UK over the last 80 years. Do you think it's had a positive impact? Has it had any impact? And how could social movements have an impact?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, I think as someone who's been involved in activism and campaigning, a lot of the time you don't know the impact that you have. It's intangible a lot of the time. There's not really necessarily a metric you can use. You can count the number of letters you send, the number of emails you send, the number of protests you go on, but how can you directly translate that into change? So it can be sometimes a very frustrating and lonely business to understand it. But I mean, you're talking about two activists there at Fastlane Peace Camp, but we all know the name of Greta Thunberg, don't we? And the special nature of her protest was that she took it upon herself to say, you know, even if you're in the minority of one, the truth is still the truth, and go out there and stage the protest, which was a symbolic protest, which because of her age and the context in which she did it and the power of her messaging and the simplicity of her voice, had a very resonant effect. And so it's even if it's something that you don't think will have an impact, you don't know the consequences of your actions. But I would suggest that it's always valuable to take political action and look inside of you and think about your values and compare them then to what I want to come on to the strategic tactical context. Because I do think one thing I think we need to think about is at this point in time and this point in history, with the world as it is, with democracy teetering, with authoritarianism rising even, and nuclear weapon systems being what they are, which is basically, as Nick has said, essentially extremely anti-democratic forces, which heralded the beginning of national security states. What examples can we draw on to say, you know, this protest actually changed something, and learn from that and apply it to our specific circumstances? And I think in the UK's case, the nuclear weapon states cases, I mean, the UK is we're in a lucky situation in that we do have democratic systems, democratic means still that can be used. It is difficult, it is tricky, but, you know, whether it is letter writing, writing petitions, or forming citizens groups, I mean, they do have an impact. I mean, things like British Pugwash over the course of the years through dialogues with decision makers have led to arms control treaties being agreed, such as, excuse me, the Partial Test Ban Treaty or Strategic Arms Limitations Agreements. When you see millions of people on the streets to call for a nuclear freeze or to stop bombing campaigns, that not only has a resonance with decision makers, but with your fellow citizens, which perpetuates momentum and, as you've said, gives a sense of hope. At this present time, what I'm focusing on is trying to improve the democracy, transparency, and accountability of the systems, which mainly means lobbying people like Bill in the UK government to conduct inquiries and around the UK's nuclear weapons spending specifically, because I think that's one of the ways I think people will respond strongly to what we're seeing with nuclear expansion in the UK. When you tell people about the costs and the risks of nuclear weapons, their opposition to it rises. So that's what I'm focusing on. But we do have to face very strongly look it in the face the issue of bandwidth. People have limited bandwidth. They have lots of problems in their lives. So how do we actually go to people and speak in ways which resonate with their problems and their struggles where they are? And I think the thing about Greenham Common, clearly for the women who were there, they connected it with their own struggles and issues around power and patriarchy. And that led to its own power and influence and impact at that time.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think it's we have to be very careful with these kind of movements to speak to people on their own terms and to deal with the issues that they care about. I mean, I think nuclear risk as one of those sort of creeping problems in the background that's always present, but is not always at a focus point, is that it's very easy to forget about them, but equally it's not necessarily valuable to sort of scaremonger and to be focusing on the negative aspects at every given time, although they are very present. I think you mentioning Greta Thunberg is particularly relevant in that clearly the environmental movement, the climate change movement has captured the attention of certainly sort of the younger generation in the last 10 years or so, she herself being a key figurehead in that, but there's many others. Something we've been talking about this week is the fact that issues such as nuclear weapons do not, for whatever reason, capture young people's attention to the same degree. Perhaps that's slightly changed since Russia's invasion of Ukraine and other sort of current conflicts. But the greying or sort of the democratic aging of protest movements is something that's been quite notable. And one of our participants today has been doing their research on that. Elena, I don't know if you have any insight on that in terms of youth protest movements, as being an advocate yourself. Why is it, do you think, that certain issues capture the attention of young people in all communities, but particularly young people? And how can we speak to people on terms that engages them, conveys the severity of the issues we're dealing with, but also inspires hope and an ability to deal with the problems we face?
I think for me personally, what captured me with nuclear weapons is humanitarian consequences and rights, human rights, indigenous people's rights, and women and girls specifically, how you're disproportionately affected. These consequences are what makes me more passionate about nuclear disarmament. And I think that is kind of something that I observe. I work with CIS Vision on peace education in this because of knowledge, and I think for me growing up, the only mention
Okay, Ellen's just frozen for me. Okay, no, she's just gone. All right, hopefully she's going to rejoin us in a second, but I'll carry on speaking from where she left off, because that really resonated with me, at least on a personal level. I don't want to speak for the group here, but one way I try and keep positive in the face of these kind of existential risks and creeping problems is to look for the connections. And Elena's back. Okay, I'll carry on speaking, but I'll let her carry on. Hi, Elena. I just carried on speaking where you left off. I'm going to say one more thing and I'm going to hand back over to you. But I was just singing your praise and saying that what you said really resonated with me, because keeping up sort of positivity in the face of these problems, for me anyways, often involves looking for the connections between different problems. And we saw, for example, in the Green and Common archives today, that often they use the symbol of a web. So they were looking for connections in between different problems that actually are sort of more related than we might think. So, for example, the environmental connection to nuclear risk, for example, as you've also mentioned, these sort of intersectional impacts on women and children, for example, people, disabled people, for example. Those sort of impacts is very important. And in sort of trying to create those connections, create that web, it's easier to get a worldview which can solve multiple problems at one go, even if that's quite abstract. So talking about creating inclusive and equal justice systems across the world, that's going to create a system in which we're less likely to go into conflict, but can also deal with problems like climate change at the same time. But that's just me speaking on a personal level, and I interrupted you because you left. Would you mind carry on talking where you left off?
Yeah, I'm very sorry. It's my network connection, so I just
apologize. That's
out.
fine.
I don't know what happened, so I'm not sure entirely where I left off, but I think I was going on to the school and education. And so in my education in Norway, nuclear weapons was only mentioned when we discussed the Cold War in history. And so for me, it's now studying in international relations and being part of working on nuclear disarmament in different organizations. I learned so much more, and I keep learning about other things, that all these, as you say, how it's all interconnected and with other issues and other problems, and as well as what Tim was mentioning about like other issues that, like with spending, for example, on other issues that should be, for example, poverty and food security. I think education could be a key solution to getting more youth involved, and because I think awareness and knowledge is so important, because I think a reason why people might not be as involved in disarmament is probably, or could be, because of not a lack of knowledge or a lack of awareness of what is happening, the inequality that is happening, the rights that are being abused, and the harms of the existence of the weapons and the creation of the weapons. And yeah, I think that's a big part for youth, is to create knowledge, and specifically also in the education system to, I'm not sure how the curriculum specifically, I don't have enough knowledge on the curriculum specifically right now, but as it was for myself, I think it was not enough mention of nuclear weapons in general and the threat of nuclear weapons. So I think education would be a key way to go on spreading awareness, spreading knowledge, and about what is happening, what has happened, history, impacted communities, indigenous people's rights, the environment, women and girls. I think it's very important to get more people involved, and for more people to be aware of what is going on and what has been going on for years.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for that answer. Would anyone like to respond to that, or shall I move on to my final question before the Q&A session?
I've got a 10-second point.
Please do.
I just wanted to say that I think these issues, I mean, right now, we're going to have to think about these issues, because the UK Strategic Defence Review has committed the UK to massive nuclear expansion. And in it, it basically says, we know we're going to have to justify and legitimate all this new nuclear spending, which may necessitate tax rises or cuts to other departments. So I think people who are interested in peace and justice and disarmament will have to prepare themselves for the fight that is coming over spending and over the defence budget and nuclear spending. I think we have all the right arguments, but we do need to get them into place, because the tidal wave of pro-nuclear propaganda is about to hit us if it hasn't started already.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're facing in the UK, and we've got a very international group here with me today, but in the UK, I'm aware of the austerity cuts that have been going on over the last decade, and that's only going to get worse with increased nuclear spending. Okay, my last question, unless there's any responses to Tim's answer. No, all good. Okay, my last question was about the gendered aspects of protests, and particularly the role. I do apologise. That's my phone telling me that my blood sugar is high. That's not me getting text messages. I'm going to turn that off. The gendered aspect of protest and the way that the media represents that. I mean, I was very struck today by the fact that often, as we've mentioned, the UK's sort of identity as a former global power and as a former colonial power is associated with this quite sort of associated with our understanding of having nuclear weapons, and people who are very very against nuclear weapons are presented as very emasculated, or presented as sort of very critically in terms of that national identity. I'm thinking particularly about Jeremy Corbyn, but a couple of other sort of politicians who are viewed an incredibly emasculated way. But then again, the women at Greenham Common were viewed as sort of diverging from some expected feminine norm, and also were not necessarily living up to the expected sort of wives and mothers of 1983, when the camp was just started. So I've got a question there really about what's the role as the media got to play in the way it's framing peace movements, and the role of gender in that. Tim, you're very encouragingly nodding your head. If you've got something to say, I'd welcome it.
I absolutely freeze to go first this time. So
Thank you.
okay. So I'll let someone else go.
Okay. Elena, yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
I've done some work on. I studied gender, peace, and security, and a big thing is language in framing in the media, and as well as on social media. I studied some tweets from Trump and his language around nuclear weapons, and I do think that how humor and masculine language is being used to emasculate others that have less nuclear weapons than the US, for example, or that do not have nuclear weapons, is very damaging. And I think how you say that gender is being used to put masculine, feminine against each other, and this as the masculine nuclear weapons are security. I think that security then does not mean peace. And for me, peace is security. So having the feminine language of peace and peace movements, that is what is security. If there's no peace, I don't think I don't feel secure. So I think the language that is being used and the framing, and it's really important to discuss the role of the media, as you say. And the language is just masculine, feminine language being used as two opponents, and it's very destructive as well as in politics. Yeah, that's just a comment.
Absolutely. No, I mean, in part of the work that I've been doing on sort of long-term political thinking versus short-termism or presentism, we've been talking about the role of the media in sort of creating short-term media, sort of focusing on catastrophes and never focusing on the long-term underlying burning problems. We all know that the media is not necessarily is guilty of sort of perpetuating false narratives. So that's not a new comment, but I was just particularly struck by, as you've mentioned, the use of language in gendered ways into sort of framing peace movements as anti-national, or framing peace movements as anti-patriotic, or in this case, emasculated. Tim, I'm by no means bullying you into speaking, but if
no,
you'd like to, please do.
I mean, I think we can't ignore what's been going on in the media over the last week or so with regards to Palestine action in the British media.
Absolutely.
In the way in which the Israel-Iran conflict's being framed, in terms of just very simply in terms of dichotomy between good and bad nuclear weapons, or even not even recognizing that a particular state, i.e. Israel, has nuclear weapons, has had them for a very long time. And yet Iran is the one who's being bombed, and yet is the greater threat to global security. I mean, it is mind-blowing. I think this is the kind of thing that turns people off politics. Because I think if they think that even the supposed leaders of thought or opinion who they're supposed to respect can't even tell basic truths, which are right in front of their face, then why should they listen to them? And why should they not just go off and enjoy the nice summer somewhere else rather than engaging with public policy? Because they think if these types of people can't even tell basic truths, why should I even bother engaging with them? So I think there has to be an alternative, and someone like Jeremy Corbyn did provide that alternative. He provided a window of opportunity to begin questioning fundamental principles of the British state. But he was shut down. He was portrayed as a threat to national security, as someone who would open the gates to let everyone start speaking Russian, as Vladimir Putin's tanks started rolling over the greens of Eton, and etc., blah, blah, blah. So I think we do have to break out of a lot of these very deeply entrenched narratives in this country, which stem from World War II and the Cold War, and that involves language and all these other things that wrapped up inside of it, and these national stories, and have a national reckoning if we're ever going to deal with these things. And those are the kind of truth and reconciliation processes that countries like Germany and Japan, the defeated countries who didn't prosper by using military force, had. We won the wars. We used violence, which was successful. Therefore, we don't have those reckonings with ourselves. And I do think that's something we need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Tim, for that insight. Right, we're just over the hour mark, so I could carry on asking questions, but I don't want to dominate. So I'm gonna we've got one question in the chat from one of our online participants, and then I'm going to open it up to the room, if that's okay. So I'm just going to read out this question. This is from Samuel, who introduced themselves earlier, from English C&D, and it's the question for any of the panelists, which is, we might all be aware that the Vanguard nuclear submarines are in a dire state of disrepair, having to go out on record-long assignments in the Atlantic while their replacements languish in maintenance docks. It is probable that these subs won't endure another 10 plus years of such assignments until the replacement dreadnoughts felt ready. Can we understand the buying of US fighter jets as a panicked response by the MOD to plug the gap and maintain a nuclear posture if the Vanguard program or continuous at sea deterrence fails within the next 10 years? That was a long question, so I'm very happy to give you a second to think about that one. But thank you so much for that question, Samuel. That's really valuable.
Yeah, I can respond to that one.
Nick, by all means, thank you. And then Bill afterwards, if you'd like to add to it.
I mean, the short answer to that is no. The decision to procure the F-35A aircraft, the UK decision announced last week, that can deploy US gravity bombs. That is going to those aircraft will arrive probably within the next 8 years or so, something like that. Whether any US gravity bombs specifically for those aircraft will ever arrive in the UK, we don't know. That would come with a lot of additional expense. Quite how the RAF and Cabinet Office imagine these 12, at least 12 aircraft contributing to this NATO mission, I'm not sure. But in terms of substituting for what Trident can do, I mean, you're comparing apples and oranges there. We know from the experience with the set of submarines that the UK had before the Vanguards. They were called the Resolution class. I mean, they were held together with sticky tape come the end. And the Royal Navy and government just put as much effort and money in as they could to get them limping along, with two submarines instead of four really available, limping along for about 4 or 5 years, quite dangerously so, really, until the new Vanguard submarines came into service in the early to mid 1990s. It looks like that will probably be the same again with this lot. That they'll keep the one Vanguard submarine at sea come hell or high water because they're so committed to this doctrine of having a submarine permanently at sea, and will do what it takes, as we're seeing at the moment, to keep that up until the first of the new class of submarines is available for operational service. But no, the intention to renuclearize the RAF in the most minimal way possible is not to be a substitute for the Trident subs.
Samuel, by all means, respond in the chat to that if you'd like to join the conversation. Bill, do you want to add to that?
Just very quickly, as Samuel had said, he's Scottish CND. I think he said he was English CND at the time, actually, but there you go.
Oh, sorry, then that's
okay.
corrected.
It's okay. No, just you never noticed it coming up on the screen there. Just to say, actually, that yes, I very much agree that, and I think all of us who have been long term involved, and long term doesn't mean many years, but it means actually having it in your mind about what the dangers of nuclear weapons are. But all of us who are involved at all actually are very aware that a lot of the time this is actually something that we don't hear very much about the dangers of the poor maintenance or the or the failures of activity. Because if something can fail to act in the way that you want it, it can also potentially act in ways that you don't want it to do. And there could potentially be accidental releases of nuclear weapons. And that's something that was very rarely, apart from in the occasional film, it's never talked about in real life, actually. The dangers that we all live under of one of these things going off and blowing people up, either where it's based or just being fired accidentally or wrongly, in some sort of something to do with the electronics and etc. So I think that it's something that we're never hearing much about. We who are involved in the anti-nuclear movements, we hear about these things, but the general public don't hear about them through the media at all. I mean, television doesn't talk about them, newspapers don't talk about them, very rarely anyway. And if they do, it's in something that's tucked away and only read by people with some already established interest. The general public don't hear about all of these sort of things. And I think that we really need to actually somehow raise that and work towards raising it. Politicians should be raising it and making sure that it's heard about. It was mentioned earlier about the environmental and green causes and so on. and they've really taken off amongst young people. But as I think, I can't remember who it was that mentioned it earlier, young people, as it stands just now, in general, don't have the same knowledge, background knowledge, or interest in what nuclear weapons can potentially do. And to be quite honest, if and yes, we're having the real difficulties which are happening across the world in terms of the environment being damaged by our use and misuse of the environment. But if we think that's bad, and it is, but if we think that's bad, nuclear weapons going off is going to be an awful lot worse for the environment than anything else that's actually taking place. Because apart from blowing people up and destroying whole areas and covering them in radioactivity, the actual atmosphere would be totally disrupted as well. And so would anything to do with rain and the openness to the heat and all that sort of thing coming from the sun. We've got huge difficulties potentially sitting right on top of us just now, and they're actually stationed in Faslane and Coolport, and nobody in the general public. It's actually activists who are really involved in sort of raising this, but the general public is just putting up with this. And I think it's absolutely outrageous because the media is avoiding talking about it at any cost.
Yeah, absolutely. But when we were in Faslane, there was they alleged that there had been a recent fire on one of the submarines that, well, I don't know how recently, but they've been talking about accidents that they'd heard of from their sort of proximity to the camp that just had totally missed the entire group, I think, in terms of media coverage. You would have thought that would have been a major event that people would have been hearing about. When you were talking about accidents there, my mind immediately went to the increase or potential increased risk of accidents with increased automation and the use of AI and automation with nuclear weapons. Again, something we've learned about this week or been reminded of is the case of Stanislav Petrov in the 80s, who mistrusted technology and therefore prevented a major nuclear threat. That's just one thing that I've been thinking about as you were speaking. Tim, I see that you've got your hand up to respond to Bill.
I just wanted to add a note of optimism as I was looking through my notes.
Please do. Optimism, always welcome.
And so we did a poll, British Pugwash, a few years ago about on British public opinion on nuclear issues. And I was looking at the data again today, and it said in our poll, 18 to 24-year-olds had the weakest support for UK nuclear possession and the strongest opposition to it. So I think it's always surprising sometimes, despite like what we're discussing, the fact that, as Bill's described, there's lack of public information in the media and elsewhere. People in their bones have quite strong opinions on this. And with the youth, I think that's just because when you're at university, when you're young, you have more freedom to develop your own ideas and have independent thought. So I think we just have to find a way to corral that and utilize that kind of those kind of ideas and that energy. And like one small thing that we do at British Pugwash is have a student and young Pugwash group, which has an annual conference to get people together. But I think those are the kind of things we need to do much more of. But unfortunately, there just isn't that much money out there at the moment, because I think that funders either sometimes think that the issue isn't worth investing in because you won't get a political result or political impact, or it's not a top 10 issue at the moment. So I think we do have to think about that. How do we fund the next generation so you can work on these issues? Because there is not very much funding for jobs or careers working around arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation. You don't only need money, but it does help.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as we heard from Susie Snyder the other day, the sort of financial role that lobby groups in the sort of pro-nuclear space is massive, and the amount of investment still going into nuclear weapons is huge. So it's very hard to ignore that. Samuel, I've seen your answer again. Apologies, Scottish C&D, and Samuel said it's very helpful answers. The risk posed by out-of-date vessels, so radioactive leakages in Clyde, increased risk of incidents at Faslane, etc., help underpin the argument against deterrence, i.e. that the weapons keep us safe. Elena, would you please respond? And then I'm going to open the questions up to the room that I'm sitting in. Thank you.
I just had a short comment on the media coverage part. something that I would like to see is more coverage also in movies and the movie industry of these consequences that Bill was talking of radiation and the consequences of a bomb and living close to a bomb and living close to these facilities. Because as the Pentagon has this deal with Hollywood producers of presenting the military in the best way possible, I think is very destructive, and I would like to see a reform of that and more movies on consequences and more movies on impacts on impacted communities. That would be, I think, a really good way to spread awareness and knowledge of the impacts and consequences of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about the sort of creative industries engaging with this world. And we know there's lots of artists who do that, but possibly not in the mainstream. When you're talking about education, I was thinking, and I'm not suggesting this, this is a thought I only just had, but what would be the impact of curriculums taking up things like Annie Jacobsen's nuclear war scenario? I mean, I don't want to be sort of scaremongering, but that kind of thing in an education system could be potentially very effective. Okay, I'm going to open up the room to questions. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to read Samuel's answer first. Oh, interesting. Okay. Annie Jacobsen's nuclear war has in fact been bought by, presuming, a producer or director. That's thank you very much for that information. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I've got a spare seat right next to me, and I'm gonna invite people to come sit down. Nick, sorry, you had a hand up. By all means, speak.
Yeah. Just, I mean, educating is obviously really important. I mean, I teach students at York about global nuclear politics, but just to sort of reflag my earlier point, scaring people only gets you so far. We see this with the climate emergency debate, right? People think it's just too big, that they have no agency, and they check out.
Yeah.
I mean, what's more important, particularly for today's under 30 generation, is that they've grown up in a world in which nuclear weapons just really don't make any sense in terms of the security challenges that they've been through. And that's going to be that it will be the case through, through their lives and their kids' lives and so on. We don't live in the 1950s anymore. International security does not look like that. All the big threats have been transnational over the last 20 years, and that's going to be that trend will increase. All the metrics show us that. And so the key thing for me, I think, is encouraging, enabling the under 20s and under 30s to think about what security means for them as citizens in their states, and in what world does the capacity to threaten and potentially inflict massive nuclear violence on another society make any sense within that. And that's a more kind of positive reframing of security, in which when that meets the ingrained ideology of nuclear deterrence, as we see in our political and military and media elite in the UK, you can ask the question, you're equipped to ask the question, explain to me why this makes sense. And you put that question, and it's very difficult. Very difficult. It's a pretty tortured logic that you have to go through, compared to the lived experience of overlapping insecurities from transnational challenges, not state-based military on military challenges.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think your point about people sort of checking out, we can't be thinking about sort of thinking of fear at every second, every juncture. And the result of that is either people checking out and disengaging with these issues. Some people, frustration and sort of lack of trust in institutional voices and politicians leads them to join camps like Buzzlane, but that's certainly not the case for lots of people. Yeah, thank you for that point. Okay, questions from the room. Okay, yeah, so come around and sit next to me here. I'm going to be here, but I'm going to let the participants speak to you now. I'll let her introduce herself to you.
Hi, everyone. This is Aisha. Thank you so much, first of all, for a very informative session. And I'm very grateful to be here and to be asking you this question. So since our today's webinar is very much focused on Scotland and in broader the UK's or the Britain's nuclear policy, so I'm going to ask a very focused question. We all know that the Scottish National Party, or the Scotland in general, is very much vocal against the presence of nuclear weapon on the Scottish soil, particularly the presence of triad system at the HMNB Clyde or the False Lane. And pretty much of this is rooted in the ethical consideration and also in the broader, you can say, the political project of Scotland's potential independence. So I want to ask you, how do you see how far and in what ways has the Scottish National Party or the Scotland's anti-nuclear rhetoric in general has been able to influence Britain's overall nuclear policy, and how do you see the future of these two? Do you think in the future Scotland's anti-nuclear stance would be able to influence Britain's nuclear overall policy, or how do you see that? I mean, like, this question is not very not specific to any particular speaker, and any one of you who would like to just, you know, give your remarks on this, that would be helpful.
Bill, please go ahead if you'd like to.
Yep. Thanks, Aisha. Thank you for bringing your question there. I'll just say what I think about a reply to what you've been asking there. Because I am a member of the Scottish National Party, I'm a member of the Scottish Parliament as such, and this is something which has been, it's not something which comes and goes in the SNP, and for many people in other political parties as well, it's something which is to the core of what they believe in, but it may not be to the core of what their party believes in, so there's variations there. But as far as I'm concerned, this is something which has been a long-term major issue for me, and it's one of the reasons why I first became involved with the Scottish National Party a long time before there was any opportunity for achieving any kind of political power, really. But it's something that has stuck over the years, and something which I'm pleased has stuck over the years. As I mentioned earlier, you know, I presented from the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon. I presented at the TPNW when the treaty was coming through the United Nations. I presented a letter saying that Scotland supports the TPNW, wants to see it, and when we have the power to actually attend the United Nations as an independent country, we will sign up to it and will promote this and speak on its behalf. So that's something that's been on as right at the top of the party's level. Now, how we can use that to influence UK government is mostly, from my point of view and the way that I perceive it, is mostly to try and get as much discussion in the general population and through the media about the matter of nuclear weapons as we possibly can. I think the only way that we're able to influence this just now is to do as pretty much anyone should be trying to do, and that is to have it in the general populations right in their face, and say, why is the UK government not listening to what the people actually want? Why are they actually pursuing this nuclear weapons program? Why are they even growing it and developing it rather than actually taking it in the other direction? And I think that's one of the ways in which we can actually influence things. I'm going to go off at a minor tangent, if you don't mind, and say, following from John Kerry, the US Secretary of State under President Obama, I was, in 2015, I was speaking to the Iranian government in Tehran about them not developing nuclear weapons. And Mr. Kerry, John Kerry, had actually promised them that if they didn't go down that route, then America was going to be supportive of them in developing their economic potential and their international relationships with other countries around the world. And it was heading in that direction very strongly and had been signed as a treaty. And, you know, that was the way things were until 1 month after I had been speaking to the Iranian government. President Trump came in for his first visit to the White House and went on television and tore up the treaty. He decided this was rubbish and it wasn't going to happen. That then damaged that Iranian government, which then was replaced by a government which was much more virulently oppositional, and who decided that they were going to go ahead and actually develop the nuclear weapons. So it was Mr. Trump who actually had brought this all about in the first place, in spite of everything that he's been saying and doing since then. So all I'm saying is that these are the type of things that we need to get into people's minds, into their knowledge and awareness. And I think then that's the kind of thing that would put pressure on the UK government, because they don't have that kind of pressure on them. They just ignore anything from us as civil society, and they go ahead with what they want. And I think we need to do it that way. Thank you. I hope that's of some reasonable answer to you.
No, thank you so much. I couldn't agree more with you. That's very nice. We need to get this all thing and this anti-nuclear rhetoric into the minds of the people so that we would be able to, influence those who are in the power to, get the things done, which are like in the favor of the overall generations and the future generations as well. So thank you so much for your insightful answer. Thank you.
Okay, another question from the room. Yeah, perfect.
Hi there, I'm Chingwei. It's great to meet all of you. It's great to see one familiar face up there. Yeah, and thanks for the discussion as well. So my question is regarding arms control and reducing nuclear stockpiles, right? So we hear a lot about the US and the USSR and their experience, and US and the Russians as well with New START, for example. So excuse my ignorance, but considering this panel and the makeup of the experts here, what role has the UK played, if any, in such measures in the past, or even just with sort of risk reduction measures, such as direct hotlines, for example? Has there been historical considerations in this context about setting up such things? Because I'm thinking in terms of lessons learned from past experiences that could be brought into a potential future if the UK has specific roles or expertise it can bring to the table in this context. Thank you.
Do you want me to say something on that?
Please do.
Yeah, so the UK hasn't been involved in any negotiated nuclear arms control reduction processes. It was sort of involved in the political process to denuclearize Ukraine as one of the three depository states of the NPT, and those political guarantees that were given to Ukraine. But it has made pretty significant contributions to the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and the process that has yet to deliver a fissile material cut-off treaty, but the UK has put quite a bit of work into that, and more recently, over the last sort of 2 decades or so, into nuclear disarmament verification. So it's done some good things, but that's all within the context of insisting on the legitimacy and necessity of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. So there's been zero really questioning of that within UK governments throughout the nuclear age, Cold War and post-Cold War. But within that context, in terms of trying to manage nuclear weapons dynamics and reduce the risks of nuclear violence, the UK has done some positive things, but I wouldn't go any further than that. Yeah, I don't know if others have different views or additional things to add to that.
The chair has allowed me a quick follow-up to that. So thank you. So in terms of why the UK hasn't done more, then do we see a sort of similar argument as from China, for example, right now, where they're talking about how they have relatively less nuclear weapons, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just thinking in terms of what are the considerations that stop the UK from doing more than that? Are we talking about sort of alliance dynamics here as well?
Yeah, I would say there's a couple of reasons. One is certainly alliance dynamics, both with the US and France. The second is what was touched on earlier in ideas of identity that are very much wrapped up in continuing to be a nuclear armed state. But then you have a narrative that you'll see from China too, that the UK will commit its nuclear arsenal to arms control reduction processes when Russia and the United States reduce down to much lower levels. So that's essentially saying we're not going to do anything until world politics enable Russia and the US to get down to probably below 1,000, maybe below 500, something like that. So it's quite a nice get out clause for having to do anything really. So the UK makes that argument, as does China. I don't think the French do. I mean, the French are going to be the last to disarm. We're just going to have to accept that. I think North Korea will go before France ever does, but that's a different story. But yeah, so there's some commonalities there with this kind of this minimum deterrence. You might have, I don't know if you've come across the ideas of minimum deterrence, right? So that's a way of saying, we're the good guys, we're responsible nuclear armed states, which is a contradiction in terms, right? To be a responsible nuclear armed state. But we do minimum deterrence, blah blah blah. We don't do all this maximum deterrence stuff. We're kind of the good guys when it comes to having nuclear weapons. And this is a narrative that we see in a different cultural context and historical context from China too. And we you can trust us with nuclear weapons. It's the likes of Iran and North Korea that you can't trust. We're kind of the good nuclear armed states guys. And occasionally China will be accepted by Western states as being part of that group too. Occasionally Russia will until it does things like invade Ukraine and Georgia and so on. So you certainly have that narrative that the UK perpetuates and in some ways hides behind to justify basically not doing anything on actually reducing in a verifiable and transparent way its nuclear stockpile.
Thank
Want to
you.
respond, you're welcome.
I'm good. Thanks so much.
I mean, yeah, some good things is not a rave review about the UK's involvement. Do we have any responses to Nick's answer? Or shall I move on to the last question?
I mean, I just say that again, look at the Strategic Defence Review, which came out a few weeks ago from a Labour government, which historically has made some moves on non-proliferation disarmament, signed the NPT as a depository state in the 60s under Harold Wilson, and now has nothing to say about what leading on the NPT will mean. All it has to say is, we need more nukes because that will stop other people getting them, which is our contribution to non-proliferation. That's literally what it says. So they're in a difficult position because the NPT review conference is next year, and the UK is leading this P5 group who are of the major nuclear powers who are supposed to meet fairly regularly to discuss these issues. And what is the story the UK has to tell? It's becoming a very different story than it used to be. As Nick says, it has made some contributions, but now it seems to have just given up.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to sound too defeated, but I can, only agree with that. I'm going to invite I think this might be our last question for the evening, and I'm very grateful for your giving your Monday evenings to us. But Franco's going to come ask you a question now.
Hello, everyone. My name is Franco. I'm originally from Mexico and a PhD student now in the UK. I have a very blurry question that I'm going to try to entangle, and I'm trying to think about the intergenerational dynamics and long-term thinking and the role that memory has in nuclear politics today. So, Elena mentioned that she first learned about this through education about the Cold War. And I think that's the case for many of us. I know in Japan specifically, it's about the atomic bomb in 1945. Tim, I'm sure that in Pugwash, a lot has to do with commemoration of Einstein and Russell and Joseph Rotblat and all these heroes of disarmament within the scientist community. And Greta Thunberg was mentioned as like like a hero of the climate movement. So I'm wondering, for instance, if we are too focused on remembering these figures, and yet when we are modernizing nuclear weapons, we do not have a clear idea of who's the Oppenheimer of today. Who are these scientists who are like obviously still making revolutionary changes to incorporation of AI into nuclear submarines or nuclear targeting satellites. Why do we not have this sort of clarity that seemed to be there in during the Cold War about who's doing what in terms of the innovation with nuclear weapons? And so that's kind of like one part of my question. Maybe I'll just leave it there, and then if there's a chance to follow up, then I'll ask something else.
Do you have a specific person you're asking, or is it free?
For anyone, yeah. I guess
guess
okay, yes.
I can hop in and say that I do think that it would be really good to have a specific like I don't have enough knowledge, so there might be somebody who is like specifically working right now. I can think of organizations that I see as role models that are working, and I think ICANN is obviously my first thought of like internationally speaking, but on local levels there is a lot of good NGOs and organizations that you can see as a role model. But I do think I mean I agree with you. I think it would be good to have a specific person who could be a role model. But why I can't think of one specific, and I'm not sure why. There is definitely need for more maybe popularity towards the movement. Maybe it would be. I remember at the Scottish government at the cross-party group with Bill Kidd. I remember we had a visit from the ambassador of Kazakhstan, and I remember him mentioning getting even more influencers involved in the movement, people who have big platforms, creating popularity and creating awareness towards the movement. I remember him mentioning that. So maybe that could be a way forward to involve more people with large platforms on social media. Could maybe be a way forward.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that insight. As you say, influencers, the word is in the name, influence, have the platforms that we're looking for. Nick, are you wanting to respond?
Yeah, I mean, just to say that there isn't any innovation in nuclear weapons now. This is 1950s technology. Thermonuclear warheads, miniaturized thermonuclear warheads, and intercontinental ballistic missiles are fundamentally 1950s technology. So there isn't really any innovation going on there. Military innovation is in AI and quantum computing. That's going to be those two technologies are going to rewrite society and economy and militaries over the next couple of decades. And I think the way I think about this, and one way to think about it, is that nuclear deterrence is a system of security that at root claims to rest on exploiting mutual vulnerability to massive nuclear violence and the stabilizing effects that are claimed in many ways wrongly, but are claimed to stem from that. I think an interesting question is to explore the multiple and deep mutual vulnerabilities that we face now and that are going to increase as AI and quantum computing breakthroughs, which could be really rapid. I mean, you kind of think of these things over the next few decades, could be in the next kind of 4 or 5 years, really transformative changes, and how they're going to just make intrinsic intersocietal vulnerabilities just inescapably part of the world we live in, and how that is, again, is going to necessarily transform how we think about security, and the role of sort of military violence within that. I mean, I guess just to note in this context how difficult it has been really since World War II to win wars, conventional wars. It's very difficult. That militaries are facing and have done for decades, but Vladimir Putin is finding this out. Israel is finding this out, that there are really rapid diminishing returns to violence for states. Really difficult to think about winning a conventional war, let alone, the nonsense of winning a nuclear war. And these deep interconnections, ever deepening depth and breadth of mutual vulnerabilities between our societies is going to exacerbate that. So yeah, I would avoid thinking about innovation in the nuclear weapons realm, because this is old tech. A new tech is going to rewrite mutual vulnerability and therefore rewrite how we think about this concept of deterrence. And the nuclear component of that, I just think will seem just utterly nonsensical.
Yeah, thank you, Nick, very much for that answer. And also Samuel for your contribution in the chat about the IPPNW and their US counterparts doing good work. Samuel, I apologize that you've been relegated to the chat. But if you want to represent any of the views from CND in this perspective, please do. I will just give a quick moment to check there's no other questions from the room or from... Yeah, okay, I have one more question from the room. And I'll also open it up to the online viewers as well, in which case after that I will release you to your evenings. But Jingwei is going to ask one more question.
Hey, sorry to keep everyone here for slightly longer. Thanks for your time. Yeah, I was wondering, again, considering the panel here, are there specific nuances in how we should understand the UK's position on the TPNW as compared to the rest of the P5, or maybe as compared to the US or France? Because I do understand, obviously, that opposition is one of the few things that the P5 can agree on right now, as indicated through joint statements, for example. But any tidbits of insight from your end would be quite interesting. Thank you.
Bill, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to go. I'm going to cheat slightly and answer you in a different way from what your question is. I think that I don't know enough about the political workings of the other P5 members actually to be able to compare them all in and out sort of. But I do believe that there is, in spite of what I said earlier, I do believe that there is an awareness within the UK that there is a strong anti-nuclear presence in terms of the organisations which exist, but and also in terms of the general population who do have an awareness. They just don't know where that awareness is going or what to do about it. So they'll hear things about nuclear and they'll go, oh, there's stuff about nuclear again, but then the next day they don't hear about it again. So it sort of drifts off slightly, but they do have some awareness that we are in the UK a nuclear power. And I think that does have a bit of an influence within the government in terms of its how it likes to present itself. It is actually advancing the numbers of nuclear weapons which are held, or at least it's aiming to do so. But at the same time, it likes to present itself as being aware of other nations around the world and how it's actually wants to be a friend rather than a threatening enemy, etc., etc. All this sort of stuff, which I don't think actually really particularly bothers Mr. Putin's government in Russia. And it certainly doesn't seem to be of any bother at all within the period that President Trump will be there anyway. He's not concerned about other countries to the extent that he thinks that he might actually want to take them over anyway and actually make them part of the United States of America or something bizarre. So I do, however, think that it's important that we in P5 nations, those of us who are aware of the difficulties and dangers of nuclear weapons, should actually be building connections with other nations around the world. And one of the ways that we can do that, and it has actually happened to a reasonable degree at United Nations conferences, is to bring in people who have had their lives destroyed, or at least severely, very, very severely damaged by being used as areas of test ground explosions. Now, there are people from across the world where we see this. It possibly even started in the first instance in Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Why were the bombs dropped there? Was that to stop Russia from advancing towards taking over Japan? Why did they not then drop them in Eastern Europe to stop Russia from advancing and taking over Eastern Europe, European countries? It may be because the people in Eastern Europe were white and the people in Japan weren't. And it may be that the areas in North America where the bombs have been used were in, pardon me, in the areas where Native Americans mostly live, and in Australia where the Aboriginal people live. And these type of things actually have happened all over the world, including in the Pacific and other areas as well. And I think that what we need to do is to build strong relationships with people who've been damaged by these test explosions, and get that across to the world about the dangers that this, show them how it really genuinely affects people rather than just talking about it. Show the realities of what has taken place, and I think that would build real interest right across the world. And I think that's something that we need to do. And rather than let nations' governments make all the decisions, show what nations' governments have actually done to people, real people around the world, and could be doing all over again if they maintain these weapons. So that's one of the things I just wanted to round off with anyway, actually. But thanks for your question, because I think that was an important one. I just didn't have enough background knowledge to be able to answer it properly. So
No, thank you so much for your answer. I'll let Chingwei respond in 1 second, but I think yeah, you were talking about the Pacific Islands. I mean, the term nuclear colonialism is used now to describe them, which it seems very fitting in terms of the sort of disproportionate impact that certain peoples in the world have from nuclear weapons. Nick, I see that you've got your hand up to respond to Bill, I presume.
Yeah, just on that, also on the UK's diplomacy around the TPNW. I mean, it remains opposed deeply, but UK and US positions have softened a bit since entry into force of the treaty. A bit. The UK has sort of lent into doing some work around irreversibility and nuclear disarmament verification, previously on constraining Iran's enrichment program, and doing that with non-nuclear weapon states like Mexico and Indonesia and so on. So it's a bit more inclined to work on issues that support parts of the TPNW agenda with prominent TPNW member states, but on no account can that be called anything to do with the TPNW. So there's been a bit of that, but fundamentally, the UK government and the nuclear weapon states are deeply opposed to the TPNW, frame it as unacceptable because it delegitimizes quite openly nuclear deterrence. And the other thing, just to note, picking up on Bill's important comment there, is that the UK government maintains that all of the humanitarian and environmental remediation work that it sees itself as obligated to undertake in relation to historical nuclear weapons testing in Kiribati, the Aboriginal communities and the Australian testing grounds. The UK government maintains that all of that has been completed to a necessary satisfaction, and that's deeply contested. And so it's not really budging or engaging with that part of the TPNW agenda at all.
I know nothing to add on my end at this point, but thank you for your responses.
Bill, was that just a gesture to say thanks, or was that do you really wanted to speak again? You're very welcome to. No, all good.
No, it's just to say thank you very much, actually. That was all it was. Thank you.
Yeah, amazing. Well, thank you so much for the question, Chingwei. In that case, I think I will round up what's been an incredibly fruitful discussion and a fabulous end to our sort of 4 or 5 days of focus on this topic of the role of nuclear risk and long-term peacekeeping in general. So thank you so much for all of your time. It's been incredibly helpful, and it's been such a valuable range of perspectives and experiences coming in here. Elena, for coming in from Mexico, which is, you must be missing the nicest part of the day over there. Everyone else for giving up your Monday evening. I really appreciate. Samuel as well, thank you so much for your additions in the chat. I apologize that that didn't function quite right with you being relegated to sort of typing only, but I really appreciate all of your contributions. Thank you so much. Our participants, I'm sure, may if they come up with further questions, might be in touch, might connect with you. But for now, all the best. Thank you so much, and have a good evening.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.